Good morning, everybody, and welcome to IGTV. With us is our weekly editorial from William H. Murray. SCADA is not the problem. Well, what is the problem then, Bill?
There's no such corrupting lie as a problem poorly named. Such lies are particularly troubling when they are about public policy. Last week we reported on Bruce Schneier's caution about unwise regulation of the internet. The Senate is considering the Lieberman-Collins bill that would greatly expand the regulatory powers of the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security over the internet. It is as if our legislators have never heard of the law of unintended consequences or the caution against premature legislation. This proposed law responds to speculative fears of a national cyber emergency or cyber war, probably exploiting SCADA. The law would, among other things, grant the bureaucracy new exemptions from the hated Freedom of Information Act. The Department of Homeland Security has succeeded in making SCADA into a scare word. SCADA and other things that go bump in the night. They speculate about its vulnerability and the threat against it. I use the word speculate advisedly because we have not identified the scope of the vulnerability and have only anecdotal data about a threat. Of course, we should always be concerned when government drums up fear, but SCADA is not the problem. The internet is not the problem. The Freedom of Information Act is not the problem. But let's talk for a minute about SCADA. Systems control and data acquisition, SCADA, is shorthand for a whole class of applications that allow the operators of worldwide infrastructure to observe its behavior and to exercise control over it. SCADA is nothing to be afraid of. For a number of reasons, including but not exclusively the convenience of the operators, these applications are connected to the public networks, the internet, and the public switch telephone network. This means that they are at least marginally more vulnerable to misuse or abuse than they might otherwise be. However, the operators believe that the risk associated with this vulnerability is small when compared to the value of the connections. These connections exist to permit the remote monitoring and operation of systems that are relatively stable but which may require attention when load changes or components fail. The operators believe that the reduction in risk that comes from their ability to monitor and operate these systems on a timely and remote basis dwarfs the risk of misuse. While all of our infrastructure is to some extent vulnerable to misoperation, the power generation and distribution system is uniquely so. This system requires that within relatively small tolerances, the inputs, power, must always equal the outputs, load. The input decisions are made by industry at perhaps 500 kilowatts at a time, while the load decisions are made by consumers 150 watts at a time. Therefore, the larger the scale of the system, the easier it is to maintain the balance. For that reason, generation and distribution are widely interconnected across regions. The system is designed to respond automatically to both imbalances in load and component failures. Within limits, it does this so well that while dozens of components fail every day, most of us go months without seeing any noticeable interruptions in service. Even when the limits are exceeded, for example, more simultaneous component failures than the system can deal with, it fails in a non-destructive way. It fails so that it can be restarted in hours rather than burning itself up. Said another way, we have made a decision to take a major but non-destructive hit every 20 years or so in order to have a system that is otherwise stable enough, just for example, to power elevators and subways in a large city without stranding passengers daily. However, this interconnected design makes the energy infrastructure vulnerable to massive failure that other infrastructure is not vulnerable to. The water system can never fail this way. While the public and its proxies, journalists and politicians, react to this as an engineering failure, it is actually an engineering success. These failures are transient rather than destructive. The risk is fundamental, not implementation or operator induced. Moreover, it is less than that associated with regional storms such as we have suffered in the Northeast over the last 2 years. It is less than it would be if the operators could not intervene on a timely basis. This is not to say that these fundamental limitations could not be maliciously exploited by a state adversary, but only to say that SCADA is not the problem and the connection to the public networks is not the problem. Nor is it to say that we need not and should not improve the security over those controls. It is to say that we should focus our energy and resources on connections to the grid, not on the internet. Instead of doing that, DHS is asking Congress for broad police powers over SCADA and the internet. Never mind the fact that NIST has already published guidance about how the infrastructure can be improved. What they have so far been denied in the name of enforcing copyrights, they are now asking for in the name of protecting us from SCADA. I heard the Senate sponsors of the legislation, Senators Lieberman and Collins, discussing the legislation on C-SPAN. In support of giving the government these broad new powers over the private sector, Lieberman actually had the gall to say that government security is in good shape, that it's the public sector or the private sector that's the problem. In fact, government security is poor, but the sensitive resources are in the private sector. Both the government and industry subscribe to the statement that the reason that they cannot share intelligence is the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. DHS is flogging SCADA before the Congress as a reason to grant them even further exemptions to FOIA. Indeed, the only thing that bureaucrats hate more than FOIA is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They resist compliance with FOIA even when they have nothing to hide. It's much more convenient for both, that is industry and the private sector, to admit that the reason that they cannot share is that it's easier than admitting that neither trusts the other. It's true that industry does not trust the government to keep its secrets, but FOIA is simply an excuse. The real reason is that government leaks. While unstated, the private sector also believes that whatever information that it gives to the government will be used against it. That's just what bureaucracy does. Moreover, the private sector believes that sharing with government is a one-way street. Government does not share well. It does not share intelligence. It protects sources and methods and ongoing investigations. These always manage to trump bureaucratic good intentions. I fear that the owner-operators who have connected these controls to the public networks do not fully understand the risks. They do not understand the appropriate security mechanisms like strong authentication, and they're not aware of any target identification or attack traffic that is aimed at those controls. Whatever the risk, this means it is higher than it needs to be, and we, the security community, can and must fix that. The proposed law, in some form, is likely to pass eventually. As security professionals, we owe it to the common good and to our principles to resist it and to improve it as much as we can. Telling truth to power is one of the reasons that we are called professionals and are paid the big bucks. See you next week.
Thanks.
Hope to see some of you tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks.